Good afternoon, everyone. If I could have your attention, we're going to start our program, but please continue to enjoy your lunch. As you know, you've seen me up on the stage here a couple of times, but I have to say, I think I've been looking more forward to this plenary session than to any of the others. We're going to be talking about energy efficiency in rural communities around the world and here in the US, which is not a topic that we typically cover at EE Global, and one that I think is so critically important, and our fine speakers will talk to us about that. I'm also very, very enthusiastic and excited about the format we have here. We're billing it as a fireside chat, and that it will be. No planned scripted presentations, just a chat between three folks who happen to be not just professional colleagues, but also good friends, some as long as 30 years back. So I'd like to introduce you to the moderator of our fireside chat, and then when I finish that, I'll ask he and his speakers to come up and join us. I also did want to mention, though, that our moderator will be introducing the speakers, but they both have a history with EE Global. First of all, Jim Rogers, who you'll meet in a moment, was the chair of the Alliance to Save Energy 10 years ago when we decided to launch EE Global. So he is responsible in a very large way for all of us being here today. He also served as the closing keynote speaker at that first event, which was here. We have a connection with Andrew Steer, the other speaker joining Jim and Clint. Andrew was one of the highest rated plenary speakers we've ever had on the stage at EE Global, so this is going to be a really exciting event. So let me introduce you to the gentleman who will be leading this fireside chat, Clint Vince. Clint Vince is the partner at Dentons who runs their energy law practice. Dentons is the largest law firm in the world, and Clint's practice spans coast to coast. He has professionals working on energy and in the energy field from coast to coast. Clint is a man for all seasons. He's a litigator, but he also does project development, and he does regulatory and legislative advocacy in the energy sector. He has practiced and argued before district courts, appellate courts, and even the Supreme Court. So you would think that he's a pretty busy guy, but he also finds time to make room for good causes and great organizations. He has served, just coming off of serving 2 years as the chair of the Keystone Center. He's on the board of the World Resources Institute, and most importantly for us, he's the pro bono counsel for the Alliance to Save Energy. He's a terrific guy, and I'm really looking forward to his moderating. So please join me in welcoming Clint and his two speakers.
All set? Comfortable? Well, thank you, Kateri, for that beautiful introduction. I am deeply honored to moderate this fireside chat with two gentlemen that I think are giants in the energy and environmental field. Andrew Steer is the CEO and president of the World Resources Institute. WRI has been named the #1 global think tank for the environment for the past several years under Andrew's leadership. And I have had the honor of serving on Andrew's board for a number of years and watch him really turn WRI into an organization that actually changes the world. That is Andrew's mission. And he focuses with WRI on 6 major issues: energy, climate, forests, cities, food, and water. And his mantra is count it, change it, and scale it. So that WRI doesn't take on a project unless they're going to bring it up to scale in a way that will change the world for the better. Andrew, prior to joining WRI, was the climate envoy for the World Bank with a budget of about $7 billion. He is the Global Agenda Trustee for the World Economic Forum. In addition, he's a member of the International Cooperation, the China Council for International Cooperation for the Environment and Development. He serves on the UN Secretary General's Sustainable Energy for All initiative, and he has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. And so, Andrew, from now on, I'm going to refer to you as Dr. Steer in recognition of that. Jim Rogers is the former chairman and CEO of Duke Energy, which he actually created through a series of mergers and acquisitions. Prior to Duke Energy, Jim ran one of the largest pipelines in the United States. And Duke, of course, is the largest utility in the United States. In 2009, Newsweek named Jim one of the 50 most powerful men in the world. And of course, we feel that you've only enhanced your stature since then. Very importantly, Jim was the chair of the Alliance to Save Energy, Kateri's group, which is hosting this conference, when they launched EE Global. He currently is the vice chair of the Nature Conservancy and chair of their capital campaign, where he is in the process of raising $6 billion, $6 billion. So I have advised Andrew and Kateri to snorkel Jim over to their development committee as soon as he is done completing that task. Jim is also a senior partner at Stone Peak Infrastructure Partners. He's a visiting professor at Duke University. He's on an amazing array of boards that include the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and he's on the boards of the Aspen Institute and Brookings. In the past, he has served on at least 8 Fortune 500 boards. In his free time, Jim has taken to writing books. He has recently co-authored Lighting the World, which advocates bringing electricity to 1.2 billion rural people around the globe, and also to assisting with another billion people that have only limited access to electricity. I've known Jim for 30 years, but when I asked my assistant to print up his bio, just so I could make sure that I covered everything, which of course I've not been able to do today because it's too extensive, my wonderful assistant, who is exceptional and somewhat taciturn, handed me the bio and looked at me and said, "This man has done a lot." So that's how you will be known in our law firm from now on, Jim. And Andrew, let me begin with you and ask you to frame our issue, which is bringing electricity to rural communities around the world, and just set the stage for us today.
Well, thank you, Clint. My goodness me, what an honor it is to be here. First, Kateri, let me thank you. I mean, the Alliance to Save Energy is doing God's work here and around the world. Thank you very much. The fact this is the 10th anniversary of your wonderful EE Global, happy birthday. It's been a great honor for us at the World Resource Institute to be associated with you. I was thinking, looking out over this astonishing array of experts, the people in this room, you think what they're working for in the private sector, in government, in research, advancing something that is just so wonderful. We glibly often talk about, well, it's a win-win. And actually, we tend to overdo that because actually not everything is a win-win. This really is a win-win-win, but it's not easy. And what you guys have been trying to do faithfully over the years is really move it forward, technically, financially, politically, socially, and it's really a wonderful thing. Win for poor people because it puts more money in your pocket. Win for the economy because it makes life more competitive. Win for the global environment and the local environment. So thank you very much indeed. And what a great idea to have this session on rural energy efficiency. Look, you know, often the rural areas are the poor cousins when we think about these issues, because we're so devoted to the exciting things going on in cities with worldwide, you know, a billion people being added to the cities every decade, and in the next 15 years, the total amount of infrastructure in the world's cities will double. I mean, astonishing, never happened before in history, so we tend to focus over there, but actually, in many ways, it's in the rural areas where the need is the greatest and the win is the greatest. Look, I mean, even think about buildings. The average house in rural areas in this country is 30% bigger than in cities and much more exposed. The average person, therefore, spends, what, 50% more on their electricity bills. Think about transportation. People in rural areas, they travel further distances. Think about agriculture. Imagine the energy required to move water, which is such an important part of agriculture. Think of rural industry with such massive inefficiency in the use of energy. It's so clear that, that this is an area in which we need to do a much, much better job. And it links, I mean, interesting that Clint asked the question, what about access? And Jim's just written a book on access, by the way, and please everybody read Jim's book, because it really is stunningly good for someone who's run, you know, a major, major corporation in this country to show the care that you have for the developing world. So thanks very much. You cannot have energy access at the pace we need if we're going to bring 1.2 billion people into having access to energy, unless you also operate on the efficiency side. The literature on this is huge now. We've done a lot of it in the World Resources Institute. It's only when you use electricity and power and energy more efficiently that you then will have enough to bring to others. And we could elaborate that in a lot more detail, but I think I've gone on too long already for the introductory question.
No, that was just right. In fact, let me ask one quick follow-up question, and then we'll turn to Jim. I think you began to touch on this, but how do the approaches and the issues differ geographically around the globe? How do they, for example, the differentials between wealthy countries and developing countries and urban, some of the issues that are distinct for rural communities as opposed to urban?
Well, of course, the great tragedy is where energy is the most scarce, which is in the poor countries, and where they need it the most in order to grow is where it is used the least effectively. And so in the developing world, energy efficiency is generally much less good than it is in the rich world. And so the opportunity for progress in the developing world is much greater. And how wonderful to have the leader of the Moroccan Energy Efficiency Institute yesterday talking to us, and what an honor to sit next to you, because the kind of thing that you're doing is so obviously beneficial, because getting it right in developing countries has an amazing, quick response. And how wonderful it is following the Paris climate deal and then the climate meeting in Morocco last year, the so-called NDCs, which are the country commitments, more than half of them have energy efficiency at the very heart of them. And you mentioned cities as well, Clint. There are big differences between cities and rural areas in terms of energy efficiency and in providing power. And obviously, I think we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about rural electrification and the role of cooperatives. And this country has, since the 1930s, figured out that actually the way you have to bring access in rural areas has to be different from the way you bring it in urban areas. So too, the issues of aggregation when it comes to energy efficiency and so on, much more complicated in rural areas. So it's a tougher nut to crack, and that's why we need the very best brains which are in this room today.
Thank you, Andrew. Jim, in your book, you mentioned that 1 out of every 6 people in the world do not have access to electricity, roughly 1.2 billion. And then there's another billion that has only very, very limited access. And one comment that you advocate in your book, which struck me as phraseology I had never heard before, but absolutely fundamentally important, and that is that electricity should become a human right. Can you comment on that and the other major points in your book?
Sure, Clint, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you and with Andrew. It's a great honor for me to be here today with both of you. And I just want to say, Andrew, ditto to everything you said, with an underscore ditto with everything you said about Kateri and the Alliance to Save Energy. She's the best, absolutely the best. And it was a great joy for me to work with her when I co-chaired the Alliance. And I remember distinctly when we had the first global conference like this, and Kateri has the ability to think broader, but also focus deeply in the areas that really make a difference. Clint, I guess I would say that when I wrote this book, I was just stunned that no one had really written a book about this. I was stunned when smart people would talk about low-income people around the world, lack of health care, lack of education, and lack of efficient agriculture, and yet they never mention electricity. It's almost like the high-income countries of the world, and I include the UN in this, have a blind spot with respect to bringing electricity to the people in the remote areas of the world. And when I say a blind spot, here's what I mean. In 2000, when they did the Millennial Development Goals, they never mentioned energy access. And it was only now with Sustainable Development Goals that it's number 7. And my belief is that this blind spot is because the fact that electricity is ubiquitous, we take it for granted, and we don't really see, when we look at these low-income countries, we do not see what's really going on and what needs to get done. I think electricity in these countries becomes a great enabler for better education, for better health care, for economic development, more efficient farming. But the thing that I'm struck most with, and I'm going to say this in a dramatic way, I believe the greatest inequality today is between those who have access to electricity and those that don't. And the greatest inequality affects women more than anybody else. I just think back to a book I read, Path to Power, about Lyndon Johnson. Robert Caro wrote it. Great book. And he has a chapter in there where he focused on what happened to women in Texas in the 30s when Lyndon Johnson worked to bring power to these rural areas. You know, in that time in our history of the United States, 9 out of 10 farms had no access to electricity. Women had to carry water. The work they had to do was really hard. And by the time they were in the early 30s, they were bent over from all this work and worn out from doing this work. And when you read that chapter, as a young CEO, it helped me see how transformative it is to bring electricity to communities. And then as I started to drill down on what's going on around the world, and I'm going, oh my goodness, we are not helping. Now there's yes, it's the greatest inequality, and yes, I believe it should be a basic human right. If it's a basic human right, it would change how governments in these countries address it. It would change how the UN addressed it. It would change how the World Bank addresses it. So these blind spots permeate themselves, not just through UN, but through World Bank policy and how they allocate money. It's only in the last couple of years that they started to allocate any significant dollars to these rural areas around the world for the development of electricity. And there's been great innovation going on. maybe in East Africa more than any place with the pay-as-you-go model. Also in India, the microgrid is sort of really taken off. So there's a lot of creativity. But what it's also doing is creating a demand for super efficient TVs. By the way, my friends at Imcopa Solar say, when you ask people what they want after they get electricity, the number one thing they want a TV. I mean, I get it. And if you're a World Cup fan, you better have the electricity on in those critical moments. But my belief is that getting electricity to these remote areas is going to transform their lives in so many different ways. And we just need to make sure, there's a lot of impediments. It's government policy, and I could talk a little bit about that, but there's financial, there's low capability to pay. You can go through the list of the impediments, but let me tell you something that scares me. I just saw a stat this morning. We deployed in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Asia less solar equipment in the first quarter of this year than we did in the first quarter of 16. Now, there's 4 or 5 good reasons why that happened, but we're losing the battle because my projection is if we stay on the current trajectory, we will still have 630 million people with no access to electricity in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2030. I see a lot of people talking about it. I see a lot of chatter. I just don't see much action. Certainly not the action that scales to meet the problem.
And I think you pointed out with population growth, it could even be much larger than 630 million people if we don't start acting right now. Jim, to bring this, these abstract topics really to personalize them in the way that you've done in your book and that you've explained to me in private conversations, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with solar lanterns and also separately what you're doing with suitcase solar?
Sure. I mean, back in 2010, I was in Africa with my grandchildren, actually, and visiting different villages. And I was really struck by the fact that this young man had a cell phone, but there was no power lines in the village. There was no visible source. I said, well, how do you charge it? He said, I walk 3 hours. I charge it, I walk back. And I'm going, wow, that is stunning. And then I said, well, I started digging into it, did a lot of work drilling into it. And then with a good friend, we co-founded Global Bright Light, which is really focused on the first rung of the solar ladder, providing solar lantern that also charge cell phones. And we've done it in a variety of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Guatemala and Peru in the remote areas there, because there's over 20 million people in those regions that have no access to electricity. But I've just most recently started working with this real, what I call inspirational woman. And in life, it's always about one person, one organization that tries to transform. And her name is Dr. Laurel Satchel. She lives in Berkeley, and she started this group called We Care Solar, and her mission is to light every birth around the world. She has a solar suitcase that she and her husband developed that can do that. And they have so many great programs, but to put this in context, Light Every Birth, there are 1 billion people that go to medical clinics with no electricity. So it's not just about lighting every birth, but it's addressing, I mean, when you roll into a medical clinic, you're thinking if you need an X-ray, you can get it, or MRI. If you need laser surgery, you can get it. I mean, go through the whole list of things that electricity enables in medical care. They don't even have lights. So what she's really doing, and she's really off and running, and actually Bloomberg New Energy Finance named her as one of the top 10 pioneer entrepreneurs. But then they had a vote of all the people that were at their conference in New York. Most of these guys are in technology, they're in finance, and they voted for Laura's We Care Solar, Light Every Birth, is the best among all the top 10 which is pretty exciting. And I just say I'm on the advisory board of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and I had nothing to do with that.
Oh, Andrew, we're starting to discuss, I think, the need for financing globally. What are you seeing that works at WRI? What are you seeing that hasn't worked? You're in about 60 countries, I believe, 6 major offices from China to Brazil.
Well, look, there's no shortage of money in the world. The challenge is getting the money to go to the right investments at the right time. And I think everybody in this room, we have real world-class experts on financing energy efficiency and renewable energy. But obviously, as we want to transition from yesterday's energy, which uses fossil fuel, to tomorrow's energy, which uses the power of the sun and the wind, the profile of investment shifts. And it's a riskier investment because you need more money up front. And that's obviously been known for a long time. And so that means there is a legitimate role for the public sector to help make that possible. And the good news is that around the world there are some very important funds that are coming along. But I really agree with Jim that whilst we're slowly putting the architecture in place, for example, there's something called the Green Climate Fund that would help on this. We've got the Global Environment Facility. We've got lots of national funds and so on. It's not being done with enough urgency or enough quickness in movement. And just as this is required for renewable energy, so too in energy efficiency. And everyone in this room knows, I'm sure, the difficult history of financing energy efficiency and how wonderful it is that, say, in this country, where we've experimented with so many interesting approaches, some of which have worked extremely well, some of which less well, we're now able to say what works, what doesn't work. What a great sadness it is that the current administration is thinking of obliterating some of that incredible, if you like, architecture that exists. But encouragingly, other countries, China has been a total leader in thinking through this idea of what do they require for financing energy efficiency and financing renewable energy. Last year, I had the privilege of co-chairing with the vice governor of the central bank a committee on so-called green finance. And that's not just creating special funds, it's how do you green the entire financial system so that instead of lending the money or putting the money over here, you put it over here. As part of WRI's work, we run something called the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, or what we call the New Climate Economy. And there we looked at all of the infrastructure investments for the next 15 years up to 2030. And there'll be $90 trillion of investment that are required for everything, all infrastructure in rural and urban areas, all the buildings, all the factories, all the roads, everything. Now, not all of that needs to shift, but actually quite a bit of it needs to shift. And energy efficiency is a very, very, very important part of that. We estimated that about $6 trillion extra would be required in investment of energy efficiency. That needs to be financed in a smart way. It pays for itself, as everyone here knows, in 3 or 4 or 5 years. So the issue is not, this is not a cost. It is an investment. And one of the things that we try to do the most is people sort of very naively, including people not far from this building right now, say, oh, it's going to cost so much. I sometimes say, well, do you think when Google establishes a new factory or Tesla creates a new, do they say, oh, it costs so much? No, they say, what a fabulous investment. It's not a cost, for heaven's sake. Be a good economist. It is an investment in the future. And so changing that psychology is exceedingly important. As part of this work that we did, this $90 trillion, we asked, would it be more expensive to do it in a good way, a green way, rather than the old-fashioned way, a 21st century way, rather than 20th century way? Well, as I said, some things cost more. Energy efficiency will cost maybe $6 trillion more. Renewable energy at the moment will cost a couple of trillion more. But then if you start saying, well, actually, turns out that if we design cities for people rather than for automobiles, you actually save $3 trillion. You need less electricity generating plants. That saves a couple of $1 billion. You need less transmission wires. That saves a certain amount. And then if you take the fact you actually then don't need to pay for all that coal, and you don't need to pay for the gas, and you don't need to pay, actually it turns out that the cost actually is lower. So don't believe it when they say it's going to cost more. It requires smart investment. And one of the things we're, and you, I'm sure, are trying to do with the current administration is not to take them on like that, but to say, aren't you interested in competitiveness and growth and jobs? I mean, if you are, then come into the 21st century economics. If you look at who has won the Nobel Prizes in economics, and this may be more than you want at the moment, I apologize.
This is good, don't stop.
But if you look at who's won the Nobel Prize winners, the first few were won by economists who basically proved how wonderful free markets were. And they were right. People like Ken Arrow, Paul Samuelson, and so on. Almost all of the succeeding ones have been world-class economists, have been proving that actually there are imperfections in the market and we have to adjust. And so anybody who says, for example, that putting a carbon tax in place is bad for economics, is distortionary, we've known since 1923 when Professor Pigou of Cambridge University showed us, and no serious economist has ever disagreed with them since, that actually not putting a price on carbon is what's distortionary. So actually we should do things that are smart, which is tax bad things like pollution and congestion. And we should not tax great things like profits and hard work. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Clint.
I totally agree with that. I want to write it down. So, Jim, one of the models that you have discussed in your book that makes a lot of sense to me is the rural electrification model. One of my very first clients when I was actually in my second year in law school was an REA, Rural Electric Cooperative. And this is many decades ago now, since I was in school. And I remember going out to rural areas and talking to men and women, but especially the women, about the changes that this brought, not only in able to bring up water, but not having to use the irons that had to be put on coals taken out of the fire. Women would burn their hands. And then just the whole process of washing and using ultimately dryers and things like that really changed the health and lives and well-being of so many people. In the United States, I think most people would say that the REA program has been a tremendous success. How would you carry that forward throughout the world?
Well, first I'd say it's been a huge success. And they provide over 30% of the electricity in this country, specifically to rural areas. If you go back in history, that investor-owned utilities couldn't make the economics work to build a line out to a farm or to build into these remote areas. So the co-op stepped in with government backing and did a remarkable job. And actually, the build out of the grid by the rural co-ops, coupled with the work of investor-owned utilities, provided universal access to every home and business in the United States in the 20th century. And actually, the National Academy of Engineers said it's the single greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century, which I find really remarkable when you think about it in that way. But if you reflect on, and I was always struck that no economist did this study, at how the build-out of electricity enabled the growth of the economy. I mean, in 1900, as we first started to roll it out, average life expectancy was 50. And 50% of our people lived in rural areas, worked on farms, or worked in agriculture. Well, the life expectancy is longer in these low-income countries today, but 50% of those people work on farms or in agriculture. So there's going to be a transition occur with them, and we really need to get it right. What I did, and I have a long history of taking great ideas and making them mine, So I took FDR's great idea in 1935, and I said, well, why don't the countries around the world, because most of the utilities in, the different countries around the world are state-owned. They don't really have private utilities in the majority of these areas. Why not take all these rural areas, create franchises, and then auction them off to companies that will come in and make commitments to bring electricity to these areas? It's taken a little bit of the REA idea, but also this notion of trying to bring capital in, because the number one problem is getting capital to build out the system. Now, the grids in these countries and the state-owned utilities have a huge lack of capital, so the probability they extend the grid is low over a 20 to 30-year period. So it's really important to structure it so capital flows. Now this gets to government policy. And let me just give you a quick example from this recent thing I read on the way here. Well, some of the countries in East Africa have actually raised the tariff on solar panels, on solar, on the equipment that provides electricity. So this is a classic case of government working against bringing electricity to these remote areas. I think there's only one country that's really experimented with this franchise approach. But personally, I believe it's a way to bring the capital, to bring smart people in with new models, to engage people. Because the most successful companies in this space, they go to these communities, they listen, they engage the people, they recruit the people from the community, they educate the people, then they empower them. And to me, that's transformative to the people within these villages and on the way to bringing electricity to everyone in the village. So those are the most successful companies, and it's very transformative. And you can see it happening in so many different places. But as Andrew said, so slow.
Yeah. So
slow. And even Power Africa, which we hold up as a great example of what we're doing, the government's committed $7 billion. That's nothing. And when I say it's nothing, when I ran Duke, we had years where our capital program just for 1 year was $7 billion for one company. This is $7 billion for all of sub-Saharan Africa with 630 million people with no access. It's not even enough to get going, much less to really solve the problem.
And you're going to raise more than that for the Nature Conservancy, right?
I love it. I love sitting up here with Andrew, because what they do and what we do, I'm on the global board of the Nature Conservancy. What we do at the Nature Conservancy is really focus on land, which we historically did, but are really pouring dollars into water issues, land and rivers in the United States and around the world, and working with companies in China who are building virtually all the dams around the world. We just want to make sure they build them in an environmentally responsible way. We're working also on oceans, seascapes. If you think about the growth in the population, the need to, because they're overfishing most of these areas, and it's creating a huge problem in terms of having adequate protein 20 to 30 years out as the world population goes to 2 billion. And we, like Andrew, are also working in cities, because at the end, and we're focused on climate. We naturally, in the work we do, builds resilience, positions us well for adaptation, and quite frankly, even if we stopped all emissions of CO2 today, we still have to do adaptation. So that's our natural work, but we've sort of turned and focused on mitigation and working to change policy. Now, Washington is not a great place to change policy, okay? It's just not gonna happen. But I'm really optimistic. I look at what cities are doing. I look at what some states are doing. I look at what corporations are doing. When you start to add that up, whether it's with renewables or energy efficiency, in terms of the greening of cities, The work that's getting done is remarkable, and it's bottom up. And anything that's bottom up will become a dominant force. But the other sad thing is, I actually think it'll be better with President Trump as president. Only 3% of the money given today goes to environmental issues for those who give money. My bet is, with the things that are going on in Washington, that's going to go from 3 to 6 to 9, because we need it. So send your dollars. Send them to Andrew, send them to me.
And Kateri.
And to the Alliance.
Kateri, how are we doing on time? 2 minutes? Let me then ask each of our distinguished guests to take 1 minute each and basically give a closing argument to the Trump administration as to why it makes sense to be worried about these issues and want to proceed with them. Would you like to start, Andrew, and give Jim a moment to collect his thoughts?
And to allow me to ditto.
Look, I'm sure Mr. Trump wants to not only make America great, which it already is, by the way, but to make people's lives better and to make America play its role in the world. We are at an absolutely amazing historic time of opportunity, but also challenge. I mean, quite frankly, if we get it wrong, the world economy and future generations are going to have a really bad time. But for the first time in the history of the world, for some of the reasons that Jim and Clint have been talking about, we have the opportunity of getting it right. So if you want to make America great again, why would you not invest in the things that we know have fabulous rates of return? And especially when you asked us to talk about rural areas, where your base is, where you really care about people that are feeling left out. If you want them to feel included, help make them more efficient. Help put more money in their pockets because their electricity bills go down. Help them get to work cheaper because their cars go further, and so on and so on. So for heaven's sake, and do not leave the Paris climate deal, because the Paris climate deal is actually a very modern, bottom-up kind of peer kind of encouragement mode. The United States has played the most amazing role in getting us to this historic deal. And for heaven's sake, we need American leadership. And how wonderful it is to see the leadership of Morocco right there. How wonderful on the very week that Mr. Trump said, I'm going to eviscerate all of these environmental policies, China announced another $360 billion in renewable energy. Don't let them corner the market. Be part of it. The best technology comes from this country. The best energy law firm in the world is in this country, Clint. The best CEOs of the best utilities in the world are here. For heaven's sake, this is the A-team. Don't give up on it.
Thank you, Andrew. Beautifully done. Jim,
That's
do you
great.
want to close us out here?
Sure. Let me just start by, we've often forgot the narrative around Republicans. We forgot that Teddy Roosevelt created the national park system of this country. We've forgotten that Nixon, for all his faults, created the EPA and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. We've forgotten that George H.W. basically created the Clean Air Act amendments, cap and trade, which I think is transformative because you move from command and control environmental regulation to using market forces to do it at a lower cost. And even George W. in Texas started what today is the largest wind market in the country, bar none. And so there's a history in the Republican Party. Now, I'm not used to I'm a good Southern Democrat, so I'm not used to bragging about Republicans. So if it seemed uneasy coming out of my mouth, I apologize. But the truth of the matter is, nature, the environment, is neither Republican or Democrat. It's for all the people. There's a great book that you should get written by Jeffrey Heel, a professor at Columbia, who basically wrote a book called Endangered Economies. He makes a little bit of the argument in a little different way than Andrew made, where he talks about we don't measure our investments in nature, but if you're going to have a sustainable GDP growth, although there are flaws in GDP, but in economic growth, if you're going to have sustainable economic growth, you must invest in the environment and in nature, because that nature and people can live in harmony. And it's not a zero-sum game, as a lot of people have come to think. So my hope is, as I mentioned earlier, there's this bottom-up happening. The Republicans kind of regain the narrative that they led on for so long. And even Democrats who basically, yeah, I hate to say this, but Democrats really need to find a way to have a conversation about climate. When you tell people they're deniers, you're never going to have a conversation. You're never going to have a conversation with anybody about anything if you call them deniers. They need to invite people in. They need to talk about it. You know, nothing in life is dead certain. And no scientist, and by the way, I come from a world that believes in science, but really smart scientists are quick to tell you nothing is dead certain. But talking about climate, as Democrats do, like it's automatic, certain, you know, it's this blah, 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 it is just not that. Now, but the point is, the science is clear enough that we need to act. I don't misconstrue that point. But I think the important thing here is we need to kind of walk away from the corners, move to the center, find a way forward, because you have to have energy and environmental policy. They're inextricably linked, and it has to be not just at the city and the state, but it has to be at the federal level. We have to have harmony in these regulations to go forward. And I guess my last sort of point, my hope is that people will have what I like to call cathedral thinking, where they kind of look out and say, let's take a long view. You know, cathedrals took over 100 years to get built. People that built the foundations never saw the walls or the spires, or the stained glass windows. Those that did the walls never saw the spires. But they all understood the mission for their lifetime, and they understood they needed to make a contribution, even though they wouldn't see the end. I mean, the architect, sure enough, didn't live to see the end. So my belief is, as we focus on energy efficiency or renewables or the environment, we're doing it with this recognition that the payback comes not in our lifetime, although I want some, but it's going to happen in my children, my grandchildren, and theirs. So I think that's the long view that we really need to get things done, and not let the little problems we're having today be impediments from driving forward on our mission.
Thank you, Jim. Kateri, thank you for bringing these two amazing leaders into our luncheon today for our fireside chat.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Beautiful.
I'm gonna have you guys just sit for one quick second while we do a few close-ups. First of all, let me say thank you. I didn't oversell this, did I? It was fabulous. Thank you all very much. I have a quick announcement, but it's really exciting news for us. For those of you who have been coming to EE Global over the course of the last 10 years, you know that in the early days, we were cycling EE Global in the United States and then outside. We've been to Brussels and held an event there, and we've been to Paris and held an event there. But for the last several years, since 2011, we've been in the United States. I'm delighted to tell you today that next year's EE Global will take place in Copenhagen, Denmark. We will be doing it in partnership with the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency and in the city of, as I said, Copenhagen. Next week, we hope that there'll be formal Danish government support for the event, along with the city of Copenhagen and the Danish business community. We don't have an exact date yet because they want to, we all want to work together to time it with the Clean Energy Ministerial that'll be held in Copenhagen. We will be hosting it, though. We do know the place, and it'll be UN City, which was one of our EE Visionary Award winners last year. And Denmark actually won the EE Visionary Award in 2014. So we're just delighted. We hope you all will go there. It will be sometime in late May or early June. So tentatively mark your calendars and plan to be with us. One more quick note before we release you to go to the next set of executive dialogues. On everyone's chair is a little survey. Please, please, please help us out, fill this out. You can also do it online, but drop it off at the registration table. Let us know what you liked, let us know what you didn't. We are into continuous improvement here. So please take a couple of moments and let us know. And finally, because it's the last time that we'll all be together as a plenary, I would like to thank and recognize all of the Alliance staff, but most particularly our COO, Kara O'Connell, and her team that put this event together for us. Susanna Sylvan worked long and hard, as all the speakers know. Emily Curley. We've got a whole slew of people, and I know we're over time, so I won't name them all. But could I have all the Alliance staff that are in the room please stand up and be recognized so we can thank you? You guys are awesome. Y'all are awesome. Thank you. So again, thank you for coming. There's afternoon sessions. Don't forget to go to EEI. Edison Electric Institute is hosting our reception this evening. It's only a couple of blocks away. And again, I hope to see you in Copenhagen next year. Thank you. You guys.